Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. Our program from the LP Square Lifelong Peer Learning Program at the Graduate Center of CUNY, located in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Ruth Mackaman. I'm one of the 300 semi-retired and retired members of LP Square and a member of the Fridays at One committee. Fridays at One programs are public programs offered 6 times a year at no cost to the CUNY community and to the general public. LP Square, a non-degree program at the Graduate Center, is a vibrant, all-volunteer organization of curious minds who love exploring ideas that spark imagination, from Hamlet to Hamilton, Darwin to Dostoevsky, and far beyond. Our members teach and learn from each other. If you're looking to connect with others who love learning, you'll feel right at home with us. Find out more about LP2NYC.org, or you can Google us at the Lifelong Peer Learning Center at the CUNY Graduate Center. Thanks for joining us today. I now have the pleasure of introducing Ken Witty, a fellow member of LP Square, who will welcome and interview today's guest, Bill Easterly. You're on, Ken.
Thanks, Ruth. It's my pleasure to introduce William Easterly, distinguished economist and new member of LP Squared. Bill recently retired from NYU, where he was professor of economics and co-director of NYU's Development Research Institute. Before that, he worked at the World Bank and the Institute for International Economics and the Center for Global Development. His focus has been economic development in the third world. His books reflect his skepticism about development programs in poor nations. The titles are The Elusive Quest for Growth, The White Man's Burden, The Tyranny of Experts. His latest book, Violent Saviors, The West's Conquest of the Rest, was published in November. The Financial Times rated as the best book of 2025 in economics. So after my conversation with Bill, we'll open up the program for questions from the audience. So I invite you to post your questions on the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. So welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Ken.
Hi there. Before we start talking about your new book, Violent Saviors, I'd like to hear about your background in economic development in the third world. So what's been your experience as an economist in the developing countries?
Yeah, so I graduated from graduate school in 1985 and immediately joined the World Bank and worked there from 1985 to 2001. And I think that was a really big formative experience for me. I got to see firsthand, traveling around the world in Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, what development aid looked like. And I gradually realized over that time that development aid wasn't doing that great. There had been $2.3 trillion in aid cumulatively at the time I was first writing a book in 2001. And yet there had been very little economic growth, a reduction in poverty in some of the most poor regions, especially sub-Saharan Africa. Had been a decades-long economic crisis in Latin America. Eastern Europe did not respond well to our attempts to bring capitalism and prosperity to Eastern Europe and Russia. And, I gradually realized, along with many others, I really learned a lot from many others who are much wiser than I was, that it wasn't enough just to spend a lot of money on aid. And some of the panaceas, some of the magic bullets that we thought were magic bullets were really nothing of the kind. So, for example, we thought, aid would just finance a lot of investment in machinery, equipment, factories, infrastructure, roads, highways, electricity, and that would bring economic growth. Well, we didn't take into things like the $6 billion steel mill in Nigeria that was supposed to bring industrialization and prosperity to Nigeria, but in fact never produced a bar of steel. 6 billion expending on investment in steel and not producing any steel. That's kind of an extreme example. But the basic principle was it's just not enough to spend money. Money is often wasted or stolen through the sort of incompetence and dishonesty on both sides of the aid equation. And also the 2.3 trillion also was sadly leaving undone some of the big tasks. Malaria mortality was horrendous in sub-Saharan Africa, and treatment for malaria cost only 50 cents per dose of medicine. And that treatment would have saved, millions, thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. And yet 2.3 trillion was seemingly still not enough to pay for 50-cent medicine that would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. So something seemed badly wrong there. And, when I started to listen to others and learn from that, including listening especially to African colleagues, I started to write about that. I sort of also wrote myself out of a job at the World Bank. These kind of insights did not seem to be extremely welcome at the World Bank. So that's when I moved on to join NYU and, thankfully found a place where you could have full academic freedom to say what you thought.
So when you worked at the World Bank, what did you learn from your time working there?
Well, I mean, there were then and there are still, many, many people at the World Bank who are very good-hearted and idealistic and hardworking and smart. And, it wasn't their fault that aid was proving so ineffective. I think we can think of it more as kind of a sort of the structure of incentives facing the World Bank. The World Bank, above all, has to please the rich countries that give it money. That means it was very much subject to political influence, like supporting dictators like Museveni in Uganda that were big allies of the U.S. In the Cold War and later in the War on Terror. And also the World Bank basically lacked any sort of feedback on whether its programs were working or not. That kind of data was not collected. And even if it did get feedback, it wasn't accountable for results. So it wasn't really held accountable for whether it was success or failure. It just needed to do good public relations and raise a lot of money from the rich countries. And so those kind of political incentives really frustrated the ability of aid to do good.
Now, in your book, The White Man's Burden, um, you wrote about planners and searchers. So who were the planners, who were the searchers, and how would you compare them to each other?
Yeah, the planners tended to say, we know the answers already and we can implement them from the top down. We sort of think of them like the sort of central planners of aid, sort of like Soviet central planners applied to the aid business. So, they had a list of answers like the investment in factories and infrastructure I mentioned earlier. They were very fond of other panaceas like, education would solve everything. In fact, there was a massive expansion of education around the world, but it didn't solve poverty. They like population control, so a huge amount of aid money was spent on flooding countries with contraceptives, only to find that especially women in Africa wanted to have 5 or 6 children, so they did not have a big demand for using contraceptives. And that kind of confidence in results often misfired because they didn't really know the reality on the ground. And searchers we could sort of think of as being analogous to entrepreneurs in the private sector economy. You're sort of opening a new thing and you don't really know what works. You're just going to find out what works by trial and error and see what works on the ground. And that kind of approach did lead to some big successes. You sort of stumbled on things that were very, very successful kind of by accident. Director of UNESCO, Jim Grant, found by trial and error with his staff that there's a therapy called oral rehydration therapy that would save a lot of lives of babies with diarrhea by rehydrating them when they had illnesses that led to diarrhea and save the lives of the babies. Those kind of successes were also, kind of a heartening uh, insight that at least, not all aid was a failure, and there were things that could be found to help poor people.
So what were the searchers doing right, in your opinion?
I mean, basically just, realizing that they didn't know the answers in advance, and also the finding the answers very much involved making sure that poor people themselves were very much consulted and, included in the search for a solution. So that, that would be the way to get sort of the missing feedback that we talked about before, which the planners lacked the feedback. And that led to superior results compared to kind of the top-down solutions where you say, I know the answer already, like, education or, population control in general. The sort of magic bullets like roads and factories and education, which did not work out so well.
Now, the economists Banerjee and Duflo, who were a married couple, who won the Nobel Prize for their work with the very poor consumers in Africa and Asia. So what was their achievement, and do you support their kind of economic research?
Yeah, I mean, I have kind of mixed feelings, to be honest. So on one hand, they were sort of on the kind of search for small solutions, which they rigorously tested with evidence. So they did have, feedback on what works, unlike the top-down official aid agencies. So for example, they found kind of surprising things that worked that people had previously thought didn't work. And people had worried that, you can't just give cash grants to poor people because people were afraid that poor people would just spend it on, wasteful things like alcohol or, things that the aid donors did not approve of. But the Banerjee and Duflo and other researchers like them, and they rigorously tested cash grant programs, and they didn't find much evidence of the kind of wasteful spending like alcohol, and they did find good evidence of kind of improved health of people who received cash grants.
So as a critic of foreign aid or a lot of the way it's been handled in the past, what do you think about the actions of the Trump administration last year concerning U.S. foreign aid, cutting so much of it back?
Yeah, well, when USAID was kind of destroyed, there was a lot of romantic talk about how it used to be so wonderful and now it was destroyed. So, as you can tell from this discussion, I don't really think it was so wonderful. I think maybe moving away from USAID maybe was and reducing USAID spending over the long run. Something probably I would have thought was not such a bad idea. But I think the way the administration did it was really destructive and not the way to go about getting away from aid. Just kind of blowing up the whole aid system, not discriminating between the successes and failures. Like, we talked about, early radiation therapy for babies was a success. Support for, treatment drugs for HIV positive people in Africa was a big success. So you needed to have some distinction between success and failure before you just blew up everything.
Well, let's move on to your new book, Violent Saviors. What led you to write this most recent book?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I think I got more and more interested over time with a lot of input from my colleagues from whom I learned a lot, especially African colleagues, like my colleague Yao and Yarko, a Ghanaian economist here at NYU, that material relief from material poverty wasn't the only thing that was lacking. There was also poor people also had a demand for some kind of dignity, what we call dignity, more specifically, kind of agency over their own lives. We could phrase it more broadly as freedom or self-determination, being kind of free to choose your own government, free to choose your own life, having a voice in things that concern you, getting to make your own choices. And those things seemed very problematic in aid. Sometimes aid was imposed, by military invasion, as it was in Afghanistan. Uh, the efforts of aid did not recognize kind of a demand for agency and dignity. The aid delivery was often very paternalistic, seeing poor people as just sort of helpless, passive recipients of aid, and that we know what was best for them. So that's the idea of sort of saviors. The idea of the white savior complex came along. I think that was a very apt description of what was going on. And also just kind of the development world just had this kind of uncaring attitude to how much violence there was in development. So when a ruler like Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, who was in power from 1992 to 2012 when he died of natural causes, he imposed development and he did achieve rapid gains in development in Ethiopia, but he did so by killing and imprisoning political opponents, by moving farmers at gunpoint away from their own lands onto state-controlled projects that actually were vastly inferior to where the farmers had been before in their own villages. That kind of violence and development there seemed to be an indifference to. So the way out of that, I thought, wow, we could also look at colonial history that had a lot of violence and a lot of paternalism. Actually, colonialism was very much justified. The West conquest of the West was very much justified in the name of development. And the French economist Condorcet said, we are bringing them development that justifies everything we're doing. The experts will be in charge of that. We know what is best for them. Some of the early settlement initiatives in the U.S., John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s, said, we're bringing this agricultural expertise to the Indians. They won't mind if we take away a lot of their land, because with the land they have left, they will benefit so much from our agricultural expertise. Of course, what was missing is nobody consulted the Indians on whether they liked this deal or not. They didn't seem to like the deal that much as they resorted to violent resistance, like the Pequot Indians in 1630s that tried to resist the taking of their lands. And so it seemed like there was a demand that was kind of emerging and was sort of recognized by liberal economists like Adam Smith, a demand for, not being subject to violent saviors, for having your own self-determination and your own right to consent to your own progress. Not have someone else tell you what is progress, but the right to consent to your own conquest, your own progress. Not have someone else claim to be conquering you for your own good.
So that's why you think agency is so important, right?
Yeah, I think that's what I learned from this exercise. It's not just material income, and it could have actually, you could make an argument pretty, possibly quite correct that European settlement in the Americas did lead to, in the long run, to an increase in material income of the Indians, of the Native Americans. But that by itself is not enough to justify the conquest. If this is the liberal economists like Adam Smith and later John Stuart Mill and later Milton Friedman and Amartya Sen, their liberal argument was like, if what you're doing is so good for the conquered, why do you have to force them to take it? The principle of consent seems to be a way to evaluate whether it's really good for the supposed beneficiaries.
So in the book, you describe this sort of centuries-old debate between the two strains of Western thought, right? About how the West should deal with the rest of the world. So in one case, you have the development right of conquest that you've been talking about, formulated by Condorcet. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So tell us about Condorcet, the French economist and philosopher, and his ideas about development in the non-Western world. First, who was he, and tell us about him.
Yeah, Condorcet was he's not very well known, of course, but he's one of the French economists called the physiocrats, who were kind of a branch of the Enlightenment that was happening in the late 18th century in France. And Condorcet was one who particularly sounds a lot like a modern development economist. It's sort of like we can chart the progress of these people as we bring them our benevolent kind of European settlers who are going to help advise them how to achieve development. And so in his mind, much like modern development economics, sort of material progress justified anything and everything. What's kind of most shocking about this is Condorcet had a big discussion of that some groups will just have to disappear in the course of this, supposed progress. So it's like some groups have to disappear for their own good, except it's not really for their own good if they disappear. And he seemed to be talking particularly about Native Americans and about some subsets of sub-Saharan African populations. So that kind of gives you the clue that Condorcet was willing to tolerate a lot of violence from the saviors, even when it destroyed the lives of those they were supposed to be benefiting. So Adam Smith is really an interesting contrast because he doesn't object to this line of argument by saying, "Oh no, that what you're doing is actually bad for the material gains of the conquered." He actually said he also thought that Native Americans would benefit a lot from the influx of European settlers. He thought there would be a lot of development on the land which would become the United States, and of course he was right about that. But he still thought the conquest was unjust. He had another big quote that is not very well known, saying, this conquest has been violent, destructive. He called it the savage injustice. So even when there was material gains, Adam Smith is still saying this is a bad thing. I think that's the key to the whole history, is that there are some episodes where where there plausibly are gains of material income, and yet people are really made worse off because they did not consent to the process by which that happened, like the conquest of the Indians.
So what did Adam Smith support? What kind of actions?
Well, I mean, it's characteristic of a lot of the liberal economists that they're much better on saying what should not happen than saying what should happen. So, he was pretty clear on just that these kind of violent conquests should not happen. They should not be justified in the name of progress. But also, he saw kind of another alternative. He said, all the interaction between the Americas and Europe, it could have benefited both sides. And he lamented that it happened in a way that didn't benefit both sides. So how could it have benefited both sides? So he just said, they could have just engaged in trade with each other. The things that are grown in the Americas, like chocolate and tobacco, could be traded to things that were supplied by Europe, like horses or, what agricultural innovations, whatever. And this kind of trade could have benefited both sides. And of course, what is trade to Adam Smith? And what is not all trade is necessarily good. Trade also could be based on violence. But what was good trade for Adam Smith is trade based on voluntary consent on both sides. Let both sides decide on their own if they want to consent to the trade. And if they do consent, then that shows that both sides are being made better off. Whereas, of course, with violent conquest, one side is not consenting, otherwise the violence would not have been necessary.
So how did Condorcet's ideas support colonial conquest, population removal like the Indians in North America, and forced labor, slavery?
Yeah, so when you justify when you say that anything that brings material gains is good, then you open a way for those people who are benefiting from the violence they're imposing on others. They just claim the moral high ground that we're doing it for the good of economic progress. And, that was very much part of the justification that justified removing the Native Americans from the eastern United States and the Trail of Tears, forcing them to go west, and later conquest of the Western Indians. It also kind of most amazingly was used to justify slavery. So the slave owners said, actually the slaves are materially better off if you compare them to people still in Africa. Maybe if you compare them to the lower ranks of the British working class or the American working class. They claimed the slaves were materially better off compared to those groups. And what's interesting is economists like John Stuart Mill, when they opposed slavery, they did not dispute this claim that it brought material benefits, even though it was obviously a selfish point of view from the point of view of the slave owners. And also when Frederick Douglass came along and became a huge spokesman for slaves and ex-slaves, he also did not choose to dispute the material gains argument. So both Mill and Douglass, what they dispute is the slaves had not consented to this. If this was so great for the slaves, why did they keep running away? Why'd you have to use so much violence to keep them from running away? And so that's what, that was the rejoinder of Douglass and Mill. If you don't consent to slavery, then it doesn't seem like it's for your own good. And for that matter, as Abraham Lincoln sarcastically said later, he said, if slavery is so good, then why don't the slave owners want it for themselves? It's so great. Why don't they volunteer to go into slavery and get this benevolent development.
So you write also about Immanuel Kant and how he got involved in this intellectual argument. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Kant is notable because he especially develops this idea of human dignity. That there is a demand for dignity that's separate from the demand for just material consumption. And he linked this dignity to very much the point of view of, do you have the right to choose? Do you have freedom to make your own choices over your own life? And someone subject to a lot of violence, like the slaves and Native Americans and later African colonial subjects, those are the people whose dignity is taken away. And Frederick Douglass also later came along very much to endorse that point of view. But Kant was really the first one to raise this idea that dignity depended on individual freedom and was violated by being the victim of violence.
Now, in your book, you divide the book into a series of historical periods. How does that break down? Tell us about these historical periods.
Yeah, so progress is not, unfortunately, not just an inexorable trend upward. Even progress on freedom or movement away from, what Adam Smith wanted to happen, moving away from coercion and conquest and violence to, commerce and free trade. So what happened is sort of the first generation of economists from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, it's sort of been very clear that economics was about how to achieve these other goals, like freedom as an end in itself, dignity as an end in itself, and not just about, whatever achieves material income. And so they were really, really willing to engage in like a moral argument over what is good and bad economic progress. Then a later generation of economists that came along in Britain and America, especially in the late 19th century, they jettisoned all the moral stuff. We don't want to talk about the morality of development. We just want to talk about material income, what is scientifically effective at raising material income. And when they did that, they kind of opened the door to actually was a lot of bad moral stuff that was going on. The colonial conquests that were accelerating this period, including the U.S. conquest of the Philippines, including the European conquest of large parts of Africa, especially like the Belgians' conquest of the Congo under King Leopold, which brought massive amounts of violence and forced labor in the name of enriching King Leopold and destroying millions of people in the Congo. So the kind of moral awareness of those kind of issues was lost in economics, even as the moral issues were getting worse and worse, kind of spiraling downward, and what eventually led to two world wars and the horrific violence of the Soviets and the Nazis. So it was really kind of bad news that economists lost their moral compass over this period, which could have helped resist the turn towards violence as a means of development. Then finally, after World War II, there was kind of a revulsion of this tolerance for violence, which also, by the way, included the eugenics movement in the American Britain in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But the revulsion against the Nazis after World War II sort of reopened the moral debate, which led to the end of colonialism and the rise of self-determination, and eventually led to progress in other parts of the world, like the end of apartheid in South Africa, the end of communism in Eastern Europe and Russia. So those kind of moral gains kind of came back into the picture when economists and political philosophers were once again willing to realize these sort of moral issues as well as just what raises material gains.
So let's go back to the period of imperialism, particularly in Africa, right when the Europeans sort of carved up Africa. How did the politicians and economists at that time defend such policies?
Well, it's the old sort of development right of conquest again. We're good for them because we're bringing material progress. So like in Leopold's Congo, yes, it was true that what we would now call the gross domestic product of the Congo went up a lot under King Leopold because, rubber and ivory were exploited for the first time and entered international trade, made a lot of money from, the Congo selling ivory and rubber. Of course, this didn't benefit the Congolese because the Congolese were forced to collect the ivory and rubber at the point of the gun by Belgian colonial forces and their allies. And so that's an example where, again, the violent saviors claim that their violence is justified, but in fact, the violence would not have been necessary unless the supposed beneficiaries were resisting so much this supposed benevolence.
And what about the Philippine case? How did the American politicians and military see their role when the U.S. took over the Philippines as a colony?
Yeah, well, William McKinley, the president at the time, later claimed that he had been praying, and God told him that he had to take the Philippines to uplift them and Christianize them. God forgot to tell him they were already Christian. There's already a large Catholic population in the Philippines, and the claim that the U.S. was benefiting the Philippines as usual. The Filipinos were a little bit less enthusiastic about these supposed benefits, and there was this violent war to resist the American conquest. The Americans eventually won. And Mark Twain was sort of like the most eloquent kind of liberal spokesman, although he's obviously not an economist. He wrote this kind of vicious satire called "To the People Sitting in Darkness." That the U.S. claimed they were bringing light to the people sitting in darkness. And this looked great as long as the goods were a little bit out of focus and you were in a dim light and couldn't really see well what was going on. But he said, sadly, the people who observe all of this and the Filipinos who observe all of this, they say, what's going on? There seems to be this double standard that the people in the U.S. get to benefit from freedom and self-determination, and we're forced to take all this at the point of a gun. And that idea of the double standard was going to be a very fruitful engine itself of making possible some moral progress. As you're moving away from the hypocrisy of the double standard, that makes it possible to make some moral progress on spreading freedom to more and more groups.
Were there other American critics of the U.S. colonization period in the Philippines?
Yeah, most of them are forgotten now. There's an economist named William Graham Sumner, who's a very courageous advocate for not military intervention in the Philippines, but just let them go their own way, let them become independent, choose their own path. And he said that even if it led to less development, that was still desirable because they were in charge of what they wanted for themselves. That kind of recognition of self-determination was pretty rare in that period. He was a rare economist that even mentioned or cared about that. And as you can tell, that probably none of you have ever heard of him, he was quickly forgotten. So it's often the case with advocates of self-determination or agency or dignity during this whole period of the last 250 years. They're often kind of really dissident voices that don't have that much impact and are later forgotten, which is kind of sad for them. But they were, in the long run, they were very much on the right side of history.
And so you talked also about Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, and their approach to the issue of development right of conquest. Tell me about their approach. And
Yeah, so the bad guys could really kind of justify their own violence, at least in their own minds, by saying, well, the West imposed so much violence on the colonial peoples, we're just doing the same when we impose our violence in the name of development on, Soviet citizens and Germans. And so they kind of mock the double standard that the West had, that the West claimed to care about human rights, but only cared about it for its own people, and did not recognize any kind of human rights for the colonial peoples. So that sort of double standard is something that was exploited by Lenin, and Lenin kind of very much to the detriment of the long run well-being of the world, was able to capture the anti-colonial movement. Say, look, we offer it through communism. We offer you a way engage in a lot of violence against the imperialist powers. And, we'll turn the world upside down, that the imperialists that insultingly say the third world is so inferior, they're going to be overthrown, and the proletariat slash third world is going to rise to the top through massive violence against the imperialists. And that was kind of a very attractive reversal for colonial subjects, and got a lot of support for Lenin communism among colonial subjects. Of course, there could have been another way if the West had not been so hypocritical, that it could have taken Adam Smith's path, and to some extent in a few places it did, that the alternative was just for the equal rights of colonial peoples to be recognized, and then just let them engage in trade between the West and the rest, which could have benefited both sides. That liberal path was sort of not really taken because of the success of Lenin in justifying communism and violence in the name of fighting imperialism.
You're right also about that the most consistent liberal critic in the 1930s, at the time of Hitler, was the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. Tell us about von Mises and his ideas, and who is he?
Yes, so von Mises is one of the founders of what is now called Austrian economics. You could think of it now, it's often called libertarianism. But those kind of labels, I think, are very restrictive and kind of misleading. I think of it more as being kind of in the main tradition of the main tradition of economics, from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman and Amartya Sen. But he very much recognized dignity and freedom as an end in itself, and said, the colonial empires was this vast despotism oppressing the colonial subjects. So that kind of viewpoint, and of course he was a huge resistor to the Nazis as a Jewish Eastern European who lived in Austria, and that he was kind of a rare voice during the 1930s, kind of raising the banner of freedom and equal rights for everyone around the world as a way to resist the Nazis. And then later, that banner of freedom was taken up much later by the other economists I mentioned, like Milton Friedman, P.T. Bauer, Amartya Sen.
So tell us more about how Milton Friedman got involved in all this.
Yeah, so Friedman, it's not that well known that he did work quite a lot on development, and he thought a lot about development. And he was, yet another one in this tradition who did recognize freedom as an end in itself. And that part of his analysis was not really acknowledged or respected, that he was not just about trying to achieve more prosperity through his approach to kind of free markets and free trade, but he also saw it as a way to kind of respect the desire of everyone to be in charge of their own lives. So, the title of his book, Free to Choose, his book with his wife, who does not get enough credit for his ideas. So Rose Friedman. And so the two of them, very much formulate this idea that being free to choose as you are in markets was an end in itself. It was not just that it would bring more material prosperity. It was something that you wanted in and of itself. You wanted to have the right to choose and not have someone else force things on you. The more difficult problem was, what about sort of the collective right to choose that was involved in, like, the kind of national self-determination of the colonies when they got independence from the colonial powers. That one was harder to work out, and Friedman did not make as much progress on that.
What about Friedman in the Chicago School and their work in Chile? How
So
does that fit in?
Friedman's reputation suffered a lot from the fact that he gave advice to Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, who was the dictator who overthrew the democratic government, semi-communist government of Salvador Allende in 1973. And Pinochet was a brutal tyrant who actually assassinated a Chilean diplomat and American citizen in Washington, D.C., and engaged in massive torture and disappearances of political opponents. And so the fact that Friedman was giving economic advice to Pinochet really sullied his reputation, which is actually, I think, in the broader perspective, is very much unfair, actually. That everyone in development was giving advice to dictators during this period. And everyone in development mostly still gives advice to dictators today. So Friedman was not any different from anybody else in doing that. And what's sad about that is it's like the only time people have recognized the issue of freedom, political freedom for Friedman was when they thought he violated it. And they failed to respect, the intellectual support that he gave for freedom in all of his other writing. So as usual, the advocates of freedom really have a hard time, winning the argument, even if they're on the right side of history. It seemed there was so much resistance and so little interest in this idea of freedom as an end in itself in development.
But his followers actually had a great success in Chile, right? I mean, they raised the standard of living in the country enormously.
Yeah, I mean, it did bring material gains, but I think this is another case where material gains were sort of not enough. And that there was also this demand, the feeling that Pinochet, with the support of kind of external Chicago boys, had kind of imposed this on Chileans. This led eventually to a big backlash that we've seen in the last decade or so in Chile. That a very left-wing politician was elected president in Chile as kind of a backlash against this feeling that the pro-market approach, even if it had brought a lot of economic growth, had been sort of imposed on them. So that's yet another example where there seemed to be this demand for self-determination, even when there were material gains, you still preferred more self-determination, even if you gave up some material gains.
So, how does the recent action of Trump in Venezuela fit into this story that you tell in Violence Saviors?
Yeah, it's a classic example, yet another example of Western military intervention in the name of development, claiming that the Venezuelan economy will now do a lot better if the U.S. intervenes by force in removing Maduro. And we don't know how much force there will be still in kind of controlling the future leaders of the future path of Venezuela. But I think the interesting thing is that in some ways, Trump's actions in Venezuela are kind of easier to oppose because he doesn't really justify a lot of it is supposedly being in the benefit of Venezuelans. And he doesn't really claim to be, there's violence, but there's no claim to be a savior. And I think, that is still horrible that he's doing that, but I think it's somewhat easier to oppose that than it has been to oppose kind of the U.S. efforts that did claim to be humanitarian, like the ones in Afghanistan, that for 20 years claimed they were bringing development and well-being and progress, human rights and other kinds of progress to Afghanistan. The fact that it lasted 20 years shows you how hard it was to kind of resist this kind of violent savior approach. And so maybe paradoxically, it'll be easier to defeat the interventions that don't claim to be saviors than the ones who do.
Yeah, because Trump keeps talking about, well, we'll develop the oil and that's really going to help the Venezuelans, right?
Yeah, he does that a little bit, but I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that it's not really about that it's just pure self-interest. And just pure selfishness is kind of easier to disagree with, to debate than it would be to, debate someone who does claim they're bringing a lot of unselfish, altruistic benefits to the populations that they're conquering.
So what's the through point through the book? How would you sort of distill your argument?
And I think the key concept is really consent. Development is not really development unless you have the right to consent to your own progress. And if you give up the right to consent and let the violent saviors be in charge, you can't really trust them to really be benevolent, to be saviors. And second of all, the fact that you don't consent just shows that you don't consider yourself better off. So consent is kind of this, seems really simple and obvious, but it's a pretty radical difference from kind of the prevailing way of thinking about economic progress. Progress is really only progress, even if it's an increase in material income. Progress is really only progress if you consent to it.
So we have a lot of questions. Let's move on to some of our questioners. And the first is Lynn Exton. She says, how do you feel about the elimination of U.S. aid? Should it be replaced? If so, with what?
Yeah, well, as you can tell, I don't feel, aid is necessarily the most critical issue that is facing the developing world. I mean, actually, I think the most interesting thing is aid has actually become relatively unimportant. If Adam Smith wanted more commerce and less coercion, he got what he wanted. There has been an explosion of trade between the West and the rest, and the amount of coercion has mostly gone down despite these weird examples like Afghanistan and Venezuela. And, aid in that picture is really not, as a flow, is not that important. I calculated at one point, if you took the sort of market-based flows like foreign direct investment from the West to the rest, remittances of migrants, exports and trade from the rest to the West, those market-based flows are like, in the world as a whole, are like 50 times larger than aid flows. So aid is just not that important anymore. So I think whether it stays or goes, I think it still could do some benefit to some people or to some humanitarian crises where there's tremendous amounts of suffering as a result of war or famine. But it's just not that important in the bigger scheme of things. So I don't think it's not all that tragic that it would gradually kind of fade away.
Uh, Bernie Belkin asks, is there a natural progression of societies towards economic development? Is that how the West became the West?
I don't think the development is natural or inexorable or automatic. It's really a result of kind of making policy choices, which include, policy choices in my mind that, freedom in both economic freedom and political freedom is pretty good for material development in the long run. So that kind of choice, I think, is good for material development. But as you can tell from this conversation, that's neither sufficient nor necessary to achieve real progress, because the real progress must include the sort of freedom to consent to material development. And is there progress itself in freedom? I think there has been over time a lot of progress replacing colonialism and coercion and conquest with commercial trade. That has been a huge amount of progress. But that progress also is not necessarily automatic or irreversible, could easily be reversed as possibly is happening right now with the kind of backlash against trade.
And Barbara Marwell asks, you mentioned Ethiopia as an example of economic development led by indigenous leadership at the cost of extreme violence against political opponents. Can you give examples of successful development led by local leaders, which can serve as models for successful development?
Yeah, one example I like a lot because it's close to home for me personally is Ghana in West Africa. Ghana was sort of a horrific disaster in its first few decades of independence from 1957 to about 1983, 84. And I first went to Ghana for the World Bank in 1985 when I first joined the World Bank. And it was interesting to me because I had actually lived in Ghana as a teenager in 1969, 70. And it was clear, it was very obvious that Ghana was worse off in 85 than it had been in 1970. And that was a result of this kind of these horrific dictators that were very much anti-market and doing, stupid things like investing in machinery that was really unproductive. But then Ghana, after that, became a real success story. The indigenous leaders did do a lot of economic reforms, did away with the most anti-trade, anti-market policies, and did create a lot of economic growth. And Ghana also moved away from dictatorship to democracy. It's now had 6 straight elections of democratic contested elections with parties alternating in power. So Ghana was a kind of heartening success story, both in the realm of freedom and agency and the realm of material development. And there are other examples like that around the world. I mean, I think Chile, for the most part, except for this recent backlash, was kind of a success story also. South Korea, Taiwan, or other examples of this kind of combination of increasing freedom and economic development.
Jonathan Merrill has a question. He says, you refer to corruption by grantors and recipients both. What percentage of corruption has been happened because of the grantors?
Yeah, that's really, we don't really have a lot of data on that because the grantors don't get caught very often at being corrupt. And there are more subtle forms of corruption than just kind of outright stealing of the money. I think another one of the bad things about the aid world has been the way that, like USAID has relied very much on for-profit companies that are concentrated on Washington, D.C. They're known as the Beltway Bandits. These are private companies that take USAID contracts and make a profit off them and claim to be achieving the USAID aid goals, but not doing too well on doing that. So the using aid to kind of pay for American aid to pay for American consultants, that's like a more subtle form of kind of diverting aid money away from the beneficiaries towards, people in the rich countries like American for-profit consulting companies in Washington.
Audrey Lipton writes, what you describe brings to mind Ralph Waldo Emerson's quote that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Would aid programs have been more effective were they to have been coordinated, monitored by a strong centralized management system that might effectively evaluate NGO successes and failures to better control waste and ensure desired objectives? The assortment of cultural political differences among the beneficiary groups is staggering.
Yeah, definitely, aid world definitely would have benefited from a lot more evaluation. I'm not sure necessarily should have been centralized. It could have been very decentralized and just, the evaluators could have operated in a decentralized way and just publicized their findings. And the findings could have been used to hold the NGOs and official aid accountable for success and failure.
But there wasn't enough evaluation, right?
Correct. Yeah, that kind of shows the lack of seriousness of the aid world about whether the beneficiaries are really benefiting from this. If you're not making that much effort to just evaluate your own efforts, that's showing that you're not showing enough concern for that effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Ted Dreyfus asks, given the wholesale elimination of large parts of USAID, what, if anything, would you recommend that an eventual U.S. administration do to resume or replace it?
Yeah, like the economists that I admire, I think I'm better at making negative conclusions than positive ones. So I don't know what the right positive advice would be for reconstituting the stuff. I mean, I think the obvious things to say are, distinguish between things that succeeded and things that failed. I think the health things did succeed a lot more than the other things in the aid business. So it seems like you would want to sort of rescue the health things that were actually working.
Well, but some of the health efforts were very successful, weren't they?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. They were successful. So I would say, at least recognize the things that were working and try to reinstate those and continue those.
Howard Levy writes, I know there are contemporary economists and others who contend that the GDP is not an adequate measure of human progress or happiness. This view is obviously related to your ideas. In the economics profession, how widespread is this skepticism of GDP as a measure of well-being?
Well, there is skepticism, but I think it's usually just kind of a concern for other material indicators. especially measures of inequality. So I think the main reason that economists in the mainstream would have reservations about GDP as a measure of progress would be that they would feel that if GDP was not very equally distributed, that would not be progress. So they want progress on inequality as well as material GDP, which is fine. The aversion to inequality could also be a non-material goal. And maybe you're willing to give up some average material gains for just improved equality, material equality, but it still seems to lack any kind of concern for the non-material goals of dignity and agency and freedom. So unfortunately, those kind of non-material goals are not very well recognized at all in the mainstream development economics profession.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a lot of talk about morality in the field of economics these days, is there?
No. Well, I think economists really don't like moving out of science into moral debates. And there's some good reasons for that. You can imagine, kind of a cacophonous moral conversation in which everyone's just trying to outshout everyone else, saying, I have the right morals and you are immoral. So I can understand why there'd be some resistance to having a moral debate. But, the fallacy is that economics could be a kind of amoral, value-free science. There's no such thing as a value-free science when you're talking about whether you're benefiting human beings or not. Whether you're benefiting does depend on values like, do you value their right to consent to their own freedom? You can't avoid a question like that if you're really serious about whether, you're really benefiting people or not.
Um, I'm going to combine these two questions because they're similar. Carol Sterling says in 2026, do you see any positive steps in economic development in any African countries? Which ones? And Tom Hardy asks, what successful examples of economic development stand out?
Yeah, the first question, I think you also need to know how much data do you have to have before deciding there's progress or not. So it turns out that actually periods of rapid growth are actually not that unusual, but they're usually not sustained. So like Ethiopia had rapid growth, but then descended into political chaos. Rwanda has rapid growth now under Paul Kagame, but will that really continue or not, especially since Kagame is another example of a violent dictator. So it's really hard to kind of separate out successes and failures just based on maybe even 10 years of GDP growth data. I think more reliable is talking about what kind of progress has been sustained over many decades. And there you have other examples of success over many decades, like Botswana and Mauritius, that have had rapid economic growth that's now been sustained for 50 or 60 years.
Ishtar Schweiger she asks, in non-democratic countries, who decides about consent?
That's the point is non-democratic countries don't allow the population to consent. And it's the usual thing that if the ruler claims that they're so good for development, why aren't they willing to have a free election to say whether the population approves of their wonderful efforts on development or not? So, autocracy, dictatorship is already a violation of the consent of the governed. It makes it very hard to decide whether in that kind of country there is really progress or not.
Leslie Herman asks, what about programs like COPE in Laos that fund prosthetic limbs for farmers who've been blown up by bombs that were planted by Americans during the Vietnam War? COPE was funded by USAID.
Yeah, I don't know this program. Sounds like you know a lot more about it than I do, Leslie. Uh, it gets back to the idea that yes, there are some good things that could be accomplished. I don't know if this is one of them. And the good things often happen from the kind of searching type progress of people who really are on the ground, not sure that they know what the answer is, but consulting a lot with the intended beneficiaries themselves on finding good things to do.
Mira Kumar writes, I worked for 6 years at the Asian Development Bank. Here's an observation for which I would like your comment. The success of the bank and each of its employees was measured in terms of loans made with little regard to the quality of the local agency the ADB partnered with. Once the loan was approved, success had been achieved. The loans could have been benefited from post-evaluation, but every employee in the development bank is working hard to save his job. That's where all the goals of development are lost. Do you agree?
Yeah, Mira, I observe very much the same phenomenon at the World Bank, that the volume of loans was taken as the main measure of success. And that, as you say, is kind of a ridiculous measure of progress or not. You know, if the loans are going to the Nigerian $6 billion steel mill that never produces steel, and that's obviously the volume of money is not a good measure of whether you're making progress or not. But that brings back the idea that yes, what you really need is some kind of rigorous evaluation that gives feedback on whether the loan's actually achieving the goal or not, and then holding the agency accountable that if there's a failure, that they're going to feel the incentive to really, get rid of the failures and try to find the successes.
Bernie Belkin has another question. Do private philanthropies do any better?
Unfortunately, the NGOs, the private philanthropies, unfortunately, they have somewhat the same kind of incentives that the official aid does, meaning that they really succeed by kind of pleasing the donors rather than being really rigorously accountable to the intended beneficiaries. And so, just to give you a random example, they engage in kind of things that sound very kind of they very much try to tell a good story, things that sound good that they will motivate their donors to give a lot of money. So there's an NGO in Africa that did a little thing called the socket, which was a soccer ball that contained a miniature generator inside that stored up electricity when the kids kicked the soccer ball. And so this really captured the imagination of a lot of donors, and they succeeded in raising a lot of money to pay for these, electric soccer balls that, at night you would take the soccer ball and you would plug a lamp into it, and then, an area that didn't have electricity would have lighting, and it all sounded great. And President Obama on his trip to Africa actually was kicking around one of these soccer balls at one point. Of course, the whole flaw in the argument is that I'm not a technical engineer, but it turns out that if you kick a piece of machinery around a lot, it tends to break. And so, these things were breaking and not actually working to produce a lot of electricity. And this had not been any serious approach to electricity generation in any other country in world history, which depended a lot more on having kind of large power plants. And so, it seemed like a appealing solution to a lack of electricity, and it got a lot of donations. But having a good store is not enough to achieve development. So that's an extreme example. I'm not saying all NGOs are doing something so ridiculous. That just shows the vulnerability to that telling a good story can be enough rather than actually achieving results.
Peggy Blumenthal writes, shouldn't the evaluation of aid be done by the recipients, not the donor agencies? Has this ever been done by the World Bank or USAID?
It's something I kind of, when I was working on this project, I started to look for, where are there exercises where they just ask the views, even not necessarily formal evaluation methods, but even just doing a survey where you ask the views of the beneficiaries, the supposed intended beneficiaries of this project, how did they feel about the project and how it went, and did they feel better off and all that. And I really had a hard time finding any examples of that kind of exercise, which was kind of shocking to me. So I totally agree with you. That would be a lot better, either informally or formally, to put the beneficiaries in charge of whether they decide something is a good thing or not.
Paul Rizzuto asked, What actions would you recommend and by whom to ensure the benefits of AI that they get realized by the global South?
Oh, wow, that's a great question, and I know virtually nothing about it, so I don't have a great answer. I think one thing you should look for in your supposed experts is, they should frequently be confessing ignorance about things they know nothing about, which is, most of the area of world knowledge that all of us deal with. So that, it's a wonderful question. I would love to know the answer. I just don't know.
Carol Sterling writes, can you comment on how the U.S. Peace Corps program has impacted economic development? She says, in African countries.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard a lot about the Peace Corps from someone in my household. My wife, Liz Dalton, was in the Peace Corps in Togo, and she learned a lot about development, and we have some really interesting conversations about that from her experience. I saw Peace Corps people when I was living in Ghana myself as a teenager. So it's the usual thing. There's a potential to do good, but it doesn't automatically do good. And Liz reports that the locals were kind of amazed that a very young woman without specialized training was being sent to help them. And the locals felt more like they should be helping Liz, watch out, they should watch out for her and take care of her. So I learned a lot from Liz's insight on that. More seriously, I don't think there's been really good evaluations of Peace Corps programs.
Ted Dreyfus writes, you refer to the election of President Boric in Chile as a backlash against the Chicago school neoliberalism. How do you understand the recent election of a right-wing, perhaps free market president following the socialist Boric? This appears to be a reflection of majority local preferences. Is it a backlash?
Yeah, it does sound like a backlash to the backlash. But the instability of this issue is set up by, having kind of at the very beginning of the whole thing kind of violated self-determination in such a brutal way during that Pinochet dictatorship. That kind of made self-determination kind of a high visibility issue, and then you kind of bounce back and forth between your desire for self-determination, your desire for more general economic prosperity that would benefit more from kind of more market-oriented economic policies.
Eric Charlo writes, what impact would you expect climate change to make to the developing world, including possible increased migration?
Yeah, that's another great question that I have to confess I'm not very qualified to answer. I don't have a lot of knowledge in that area. Obviously there are horror stories of kind of parts of the developing world being devastated by climate change. So that's a big issue. I think the only thing I know about from the economics point of view is so far the solutions to climate change have not been terribly effective. They sound a lot like aid efforts, actually, but it's kind of this top-down, centrally planned thing that you try to have international agreements about, and the international agreements are, there's really no enforcement mechanism to get countries to really make big cuts in carbon emissions. And so maybe you can learn something from the failure of aid to whether climate change initiatives to combat climate change are really going to work or not.
Charles Trub writes, the East Asian economic miracles in Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and China did not take place in environments of freedom. To be sure, they were not funded by international programs advised by well-meaning Western economists. How do they relate to your argument that development only can take place by listening carefully to the desires of the people?
Yeah, so this is another example of going back to the big issue here. Is it true that you need freedom or democracy to achieve material gains? I think that's not true. I think you can achieve big gains in material income through very violent authoritarian methods, as Stalin did with the 5-year plans, which led to massive famine and death in the Ukraine and other deaths of other Soviet citizens. And, China being a kind of the most prominent example of very rapid growth under a violent dictatorship, that, China was doing things like the one-child policy that was, violently aborting babies if families went over the limit of one child per family. And so, did that lead to material progress? Maybe so, but is that a good thing? And I think that this argument of this tradition of economists that I like is no, it's not a good thing if you had to use so much violence to force your point of view on the citizens. We don't really know that they're better off, even when there's such rapid material gains. And I think that point of view would be kind of very unpopular and not very well received. But once you open your mind to the possibility that material gains are not necessarily enough for evaluating progress, and that some notion of whether people consented to this process is really important for knowing how much progress there really was, I think that would very much apply to these examples, especially China. Of course, by the way, South Korea and Taiwan were in this group, and they did very much move later to democracy.
Carolyn Setlow writes, if you personally received a development grant of $500 million and wanted to maximize its effectiveness, what organization or organizations would you hire to manage it? And what would your priorities be to get the biggest bang for the buck?
Yeah, LP squared maybe. Joke. So, once again, I think one thing I'm trying to get across, especially through advertising my own ignorance, is the idea that experts always have the right answer, and you can go to an expert and find the answer to a very important question like that. It's part of the sort of Condorcet, love affair with experts, that you think the solution to all problems is putting an expert like me in charge of solving a problem like that, which is a very good problem to solve. I agree totally. So it sounds kind of like a cop out, or kind of like I'm just too lazy or fearful to offer my own solution. I think of it as a more principled thing, that you need to find someone who has a lot more knowledge than I do to come up with intelligent answers. But also those intelligent answers have to be subject to some kind of feedback from the supposed beneficiaries, whether it's really working or not. And so you don't just give the experts unlimited power to drop a program to how to spend $500 million. You really need to incorporate in that whole process the supposed beneficiaries from receiving that 500 million. What do they have to say about whether it's working or not?
Robin Ratliff writes, given the myriad horrific failures of humanitarian aid, do you believe developed countries have any moral responsibility to aid people in less developed countries? If so, what form should this take?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this principle. You see signs in shops that have a lot of glass things on sale. If you break it, you own it. If you break something, then you should be considered the owner and pay for it. And so maybe that's a good principle in some cases. In aid, if you have an aid program that does a lot of damage, then maybe you're also obligated to go in and try to reverse some of the damage that you did. And are there big examples of that? Um, that these humanitarian programs, they are very tricky, because in the humanitarian programs, you often have to work with the bad guys to make the humanitarian programs work. And that's been one of the big critiques of aid. Like aid in Somalia in the 90s had to pay the violent warlords kind of protection gains. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan with the Taliban. The U.S. aid efforts had to pay kind of protection to the Taliban to make the aid even possible to reach into the beneficiaries. Otherwise, the Taliban would just steal it, which also happened. So it's a lot harder than you think to get humanitarian aid to the intended beneficiaries when kind of the bad guys are able to capture capture a big part of it.
Bernie Belkin, and this will be the last question. How does Maslow's hierarchy of needs fit into your theory? Personal freedom does not appear until you fill the needs for food, shelter, etc.
Yeah, that's been a very common argument, and it could be true that you don't really care about things like dignity and agency until you're sort of richer. And this was an interesting debate between uh, some African economists that criticized, aid to Uganda when it was trying to capture the bad guy Joseph Kony and lead to, rescue of people that were the victims of Joseph Kony, this evil warlord in Uganda. And some Ugandan economists were saying, you're vastly insulting Ugandans by claiming that you're just coming in to rescue us. You're suffering from the white savior complex. That's the context in which this concept was invented by an African economist named Teju Cole. And, uh, there was pushback against this by by some of the humanitarian columnists that advocated more aid of this kind, saying, oh yeah, these educated Africans, they care about their dignity and self-determination, but I don't think poor Africans care about that. I think they want our aid. I think it was Nick Kristof that made that argument, especially criticizing the white savior concept. And I think the critical thing is you need the right to consent to the degree of consent that you want. You need the right to consent to consent. There's sort of this deeper level of consent. Who decides whether poor people want dignity and the right to consent? If you think that poor people are okay with the right to consent being taken away because they don't care about it, did you actually ask the poor people whether they were okay with that? Did you give them the right to consent to whether their right to consent could be taken away? You get into this sort of deeper meta level of consent, like who should decide whether people want consent or not? Seems like the best way to have that decided is to let people speak for themselves and choose for themselves whether they want that consent and not have some rich person or aid promoter decide they're okay with having their consent taken away when you didn't even ask them whether that was okay or not.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fascinating discussion. I want to thank the audience for really terrific questions.
Thanks
and
to all of you. That was great.
so our next Friday at 1 will be on March 6th, and our speaker will be novelist Elliot Ackerman. He's an ex-Marine and former CIA intelligence officer, and his most recent novel, of the many he's written, is called Sheepdogs. We'll be interviewed by Tom Sear, an LP Squared member and fellow Marine veteran. I want to thank you all for being with us. See you next time. Goodbye, everybody.